we are talking about technology from a company that is bringing new life to demolition. Back in 1976, after a dangerous job in Sweden, two companies joined forces to make a destructive tool safer. 40 years later, Brokk has mastered the art of remote-controlled demolition by taking machines a step further by introducing smarter solutions to the job site. To tell us all about it, please welcome Peter Bigwood, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Brokk, Inc. How are robots actually affecting demolition as we talk about that? Let's, because I know robots at the construction site and demolition, and that's what you specialize. Let's really talk about that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Demolition robots, of course, have been around for quite a while. We've been making them since 1976, but the popularity, what we're seeing now, certainly in the last few years, has been a real increase in popularity. And I think there are several macro trends which are affecting this. Probably the most important is the worker safety. Worker safety and corollary to that, worker productivity, and then some basic issues of worker availability. So safety, of course, a demolition robot, strictly speaking, you are operating it, but you're operating it from a distance. So though they're called demolition robots, a more accurate term is remote controlled demolition machine. But when they're working, they look like robots. But the guy operating them is actually operating joysticks as if he were operating a normal piece of, an excavator, a mini excavator, or a bobcat, or something like that. So the first thing that affects the work site is that the person operating the demolition robot is out of harm's way. So if there's any falling debris, any risk of, say, a wall falling in on the equipment, that person is not at risk. And that's huge. We see robots on the edges of bridge decks doing cleanup work, removing material from the edges. Well, obviously, you'd really rather not be inside that machine if it were ever to tumble over the side. So safety is a big deal.
So when we talk about this with safety, I mean, you really have to be trained a certain way. Your job sites have to be done a certain way. So have we evolved now with these demolition robots to a way now that we're seeing job sites change with using these machines?
To a certain extent, you can do things with demolition robots, which of course you can't do with traditional equipment. And so people who are aware of the applications will certainly design in, using or applying the demolition robot. And a perfect example is in a what's called a top-down demolition. If you've got a high-rise building that you need to take down and you can't reach it with a high-reach excavator, or if the floor loads are such that you can't put in a big heavy excavator with a big hydraulic breaker on it, well then clearly the way to do it is to bring in a demolition robot, which are renowned for their power to weight ratio. So that a 5-ton demolition robot will hit as hard as mounted with a hydraulic breaker, will hit as hard as a 15-ton, let's say a PC 160. Komatsu PC 160 would be typical. So a 5-ton demolition robot can hit every bit as hard as a 16-ton excavator. And so, yes, you would design your job in such a way that you would bring in these lighter weight demolition robots, and they would still give you the power you need to bring a building like that down in a systematic way, what we call a munch down.
So you talk about that. Those are some common applications that you might use some of these robots. What might that be? Because I know you've done some work when you were doing the cleanup after 9/11 and things like that. What are some things for those who might be watching, say, this is where I need to be looking at some of the demolition robots? Because you have a variety of robots, demolition robots.
That's right. Well, they range in size from just a half a ton to 12 tons. So the little half a ton, in fact, the smallest 3 units that we make will actually fit through a standard doorway. So you can go in all kinds of interior demolition confined space type areas, tanks, things like that. But yeah, traditional applications for demolition robots would be tunnels, mining, concrete cutting, again, interior work, demolition work, hot areas, steel mills, foundries, where anywhere again where the safety of the operator is paramount. That's where you would find these machines. And the beauty of it is that you don't just put a hydraulic breaker on them. You can put grapples, rock drills, buckets, of course, digging buckets, traditional digging buckets, crushers, scabblers, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, and then the most exotic would be nuclear. For obvious reasons. You really wouldn't want to be in some of these heavy radiation areas, and so demolition robots are very commonly used in those situations.
So now you talk about these kind of demolition, but then you also mentioned hydro-demolition. Are there advantages or disadvantages to these things that you're mentioning right now that we need to really understand?
Well, yes, hydro-demolition, which has also been around for quite a while, probably almost 30 years, is where you use very, very high pressure water through a very small, like 3 mm nozzle, and it's directed against concrete. And this approach is used almost exclusively for removing concrete, with the added benefit that you leave the rebar not only untouched, but actually cleaned and descaled, so ready for the next pour of concrete. So hydro-demolition is used in areas where you're really renovating the concrete as opposed to demolishing the entire structure.
And that's the kind of stuff that we talked about when we got together. We talked about how that's really kind of saving a lot of things. You're not having to destroy everything. You're really getting an opportunity to kind of save a lot of that concrete that's out there.
Exactly. So, a classic example for hydro-demolition would be a bridge deck, where the concrete is deteriorated and needs a new pour of concrete. But you don't want to go in and take down the entire bridge. I mean, the rest of the structure is fine. It's just that the concrete at the surface down 2, 3, 4 inches is bad. And the beauty of hydro-demolition is that you can set it in such a way that when you make your pass over the lane, say an 8-foot wide lane, you're removing the bad concrete, but leaving the sound concrete intact, along with, as I mentioned before, the rebar. So once you're done, you haven't caused any microfracturing, which you would do if you were using jackhammers, or frankly, if you were using a demolition robot, which again relies on a mechanical means of breaking the concrete. But by using water, you're removing the material, in effect deconstructing the concrete, leaving it in its component parts, slurry, aggregate. And once you remove that, you are primed and ready to pour on an extremely good surface for the new concrete. And so, yeah, it lends itself perfectly to renovation, remediation. Frankly, what we're all looking at in the U.S. these days which is improving the infrastructure, but doing it in an efficient way. And of course, you're doing it with maybe 2 or 3 people doing that job, as opposed to maybe 10 guys with jackhammers, which is hard to find, first of all.
Exactly. Well, Peter, you know what? We're out of time, but thank you so much for being with us, and we appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, we enjoyed it. All right. Well, that's our tech innovation for today.